Harold Beckett sat alone at his long mahogany dining table. The echo of his fork against the porcelain plate, the only sound in the cavernous dining room. Outside, the world buzzed on, a small, lively town full of chatter, laughter, and connection, but here, in his sprawling mansion, silence reigned. At 72, Harold was wealthy beyond measure but carried a loneliness so profound it weighed heavier than the gold in his vault. Harold's life had been a relentless climb up the ladder of success. Born into poverty, he worked tirelessly from the moment he could hold a broom in his father's small repair shop. By the time he was 40, he had built an empire of real estate holdings, earning him a reputation as a shrewd and calculating businessman. Yet, while he conquered the world of finance, his personal life crumbled into nothingness. A failed engagement in his 30s left him wary of love, and his focus shifted entirely to his work. Now, as the years waned, all Harold had to show for his efforts were empty mansions, luxury cars collecting dust, and bank accounts that felt more like tombs than treasures. His birthday was always the same. Each year, Harold donned his finest suit and went to the small diner in town for a solitary meal. The staff knew him by sight but not by heart. They'd serve him the same dish, roast chicken with mashed potatoes, paired with polite but distant smiles. Harold would finish his meal, leave a generous tip, and return to his empty home. There was no one to call, no one to celebrate with. It was routine, predictable, and achingly hollow. That morning, Harold stared at himself in the mirror, his reflection stark against the gilded edges of the frame. The man staring back looked weary, his silver hair neatly combed but unable to hide the shadows under his pale blue eyes. Another year, he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with resignation. Another year alone. In another part of town, the Johnson household bustled with life. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the tiny kitchen, where Amelia Johnson, an 11-year-old girl with wide, curious eyes and braids adorned with colorful beads, helped her mother prepare breakfast. Their home was small, the furniture mismatched and worn, but it was filled with warmth and laughter. Despite their struggles, her father working long shifts at the factory, her mother taking on odd sewing jobs, they were a family rich in love. Amelia was sharp-eyed and full of energy, always noticing the little things that others overlooked. She had a habit of sitting by the window of the diner after school, her homework spread across the table, observing the ebb and flow of life in the town. It was here that she first noticed Mr. Harold Beckett. He intrigued her, not because of his expensive suit or the air of wealth that clung to him, but because of the deep sadness that seemed to weigh on his shoulders. "Who's that man?" Amelia asked one evening, pointing at Harold as he left the diner. "That's Mr. Beckett," the waitress replied, her tone a mix of awe and detachment. "Rich as a king, but always alone. Comes here every year on his birthday. No family, no friends." Amelia frowned. She didn't understand how someone could have so much yet seem so empty. Her own family had little, yet their home was always brimming with joy. It puzzled her, gnawed at her young mind, until she decided she couldn't just watch anymore. Maybe he needs a friend, she thought, her heart swelling with resolve. The day of Harold's birthday arrived, marked by an overcast sky and a chill in the air. He made his way to the diner, the soles of his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestone streets. Inside, the familiar hum of conversation greeted him, but it did little to lift his spirits. He slid into his usual booth, nodding curtly at the waitress who placed his order without asking. As the meal arrived, Harold sighed, cutting into the roast chicken with methodical precision. Just another day, he thought bitterly. Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Harold looked up, startled. Standing before him was Amelia, clutching a small cake with trembling hands. It was lopsided, its frosting uneven, but the bright candles on top burned with a warmth that seemed to cut through the gloom. What is this?" Harold asked, his voice more gruff than he intended. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" Amelia said, her smile as radiant as the candles. "I've seen you here before. And you're always alone. I thought, maybe you'd like a cake." For a moment, Harold was speechless. He stared at the girl, his chest tightening as a wave of emotion swept over him. No one, not in decades, had gone out of their way to do something so thoughtful for him. He gestured for her to sit, his usual reserved demeanor melting in the presence of her innocence and kindness. As they shared the cake, Amelia told him about her family, their struggles, and their joys. Harold listened intently, captivated by the vibrancy of her world. For the first time in years, he laughed, a deep, unrestrained sound that startled even himself. When the meal ended, Harold walked back to his mansion, the taste of the cake lingering on his tongue and a strange warmth blooming in his chest. That night, as he sat alone in his grand study, Harold realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The clock on the wall chimed noon, its sound echoing in the vast, empty halls of Harold Beckett's mansion. The house itself was a masterpiece, perched on a hill overlooking the bustling town below. Its pristine white columns, sprawling gardens, and gleaming windows reflected Harold's lifelong pursuit of perfection. Yet inside, the home was eerily lifeless, like a museum devoid of visitors. Each room was meticulously kept, yet there was no one to use them, no laughter to echo off the high ceilings, no footsteps to soften the silence. Harold sat in his study, his gnarled hands tracing the edges of an old photograph on his desk. In the picture, a young Harold stood beside a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. Evelyn, the love of his life. Or at least she would have been, had Harold not driven her away with his obsession for work. His mind wandered back to the day she left, her voice trembling as she told him she couldn't compete with his empire. He hadn't stopped her. Instead, he had returned to his desk, convinced he was making the right choice. Now, decades later, with no family, no friends, and no one to share his wealth with, he wondered if it was the greatest mistake of his life. The mansion's walls seemed to close in on him as Harold rose from his chair, his back stiff from age and regret. He stepped into the cavernous dining room, where a single-place setting awaited him. His housekeeper had long since stopped setting the table for more than one. Harold ate mechanically, his mind already turning to his annual ritual, dinner at the diner in town. A solitary celebration of another year survived. Meanwhile, in a modest home on the edge of town, Amelia Johnson was practicing her multiplication tables at the kitchen table. Her mother bustled around, humming a gospel tune as she prepared dinner, while her father sat in a worn armchair, massaging his calloused hands after a long day at the factory. The room was small, the paint on the walls peeling in places, but it was filled with warmth. Laughter came easily in the Johnson household, even when times were hard. Amelia had a knack for noticing things. Her wide, curious eyes missed nothing, whether it was the stray cat limping outside or the new scar on her father's hand. It was this same sharp observation that had led her to notice Mr. Harold Beckett. She'd first seen him months ago during one of her routine stops at the diner. After school, she often sat by the window, her notebook spread out in front of her, pretending to do homework while secretly watching the world go by. Harold had caught her attention immediately. Unlike the other regulars who greeted the waitstaff with warm smiles, Harold barely spoke. He sat in the same booth every time, ordered the same meal, and left without a word. "Who is that man?" Amelia asked the waitress one day, her voice hushed as though she were asking about a ghost. "Mr. Beckett," the waitress replied, glancing over her shoulder. "Richest man in town, but you'd never know it by the way he keeps to himself. No family, no friends, just comes here alone, year after year." Amelia's brow furrowed. In her young mind, it seemed impossible for someone to have so much yet appear so empty. She started paying closer attention to Harold, watching him from her usual spot by the window. She noticed the way his shoulders slumped as he walked, the way his eyes lingered on the families around him, and the way he always left the diner with the same tired expression. One evening, she asked her mother, "Why do you think some people are so lonely?" Her mother paused, a dishcloth in her hands. "Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone, sweetheart. Sometimes it comes from not having anyone who truly knows you." The day of Harold's birthday was cold and overcast, a thin mist clinging to the cobblestone streets of the town. Harold arrived at the diner just as he had for the past 20 years. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The usual chatter of the diner quieted for a moment as the patrons glanced his way, then quickly resumed. Harold was a fixture in the town, but not a part of it. He slid into his usual booth, nodding briefly at the waitress. She returned moments later with his roast chicken and mashed potatoes. placing it in front of him with a polite smile. "Happy birthday, Mr. Beckett," she said, though her tone was perfunctory. "Thank you," Harold replied, his voice low. He picked up his fork and knife, cutting into the chicken with the precision of a man who had long since stopped expecting surprises. But today would be different. As Harold reached for his glass of water, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir." He turned, startled, and found himself looking into the bright eyes of Amelia Johnson. She was holding a small cake, its frosting uneven and slightly smudged, but the candles on top flickered with a warm, golden glow. "What is this?" Harold asked, his tone gruff but his eyes betraying his confusion. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" Amelia said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen you here before. And you're always by yourself. I thought, maybe you'd like a cake." For a moment, Harold was too stunned to respond. He stared at the girl, her small hands gripping the cake as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Around them, the diner had gone silent, the other patrons watching with quiet curiosity. I don't know what to say," Harold finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Amelia replied, setting the cake down on the table. "Just make a wish." Harold's hands trembled as he lit the candles with a match the waitress handed him. For the first time in decades, he felt something stir within him, a warmth he couldn't quite name. As he closed his eyes to make a wish, he realized he wasn't wishing for wealth or success. He was wishing for connection, for a chance to feel alive again as the candles burned low. Harold invited Amelia to sit with him. They shared the cake, and for the first time, Harold found himself smiling, a genuine, unrestrained smile. Amelia told him about her family, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the small joys that made her life bright. Harold, in turn, shared bits of his past, surprising himself with how easily the words came. By the time they finished, Harold felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. As he left the diner that evening, the world seemed a little less gray, and his mansion a little less empty. Amelia's small act of kindness had cracked open the walls he had spent decades building around himself. But neither Harold nor Amelia could have known that this simple gesture was the beginning of something far greater, a bond that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Harold awoke with a sense of restlessness. For decades, his days had followed a rigid pattern, a monotonous march of meetings, investments, and quiet dinners alone. But now, as he sipped his coffee and stared out the massive bay window overlooking the town, his thoughts weren't on work or his wealth. They were on Amelia. Her laughter still echoed in his ears, a bright, unrestrained sound that contrasted sharply with the silence of his home. He had never met anyone like her, a child who, despite her modest circumstances, radiated joy and warmth. That cake, small and imperfect as it was, had done something no lavish feast or expensive gift ever could. It had touched his heart. Later that day, Harold did something he hadn't done in years. He walked into town. Unannounced and unaccompanied, he passed the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air, and the small park where children played on creaky swings. He wasn't entirely sure where he was going until he found himself in front of a modest home with a small garden out front. Amelia's home. He hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door opened to reveal Amelia's mother, a woman with kind eyes and a cautious smile. "Mr. Beckett?" she asked, clearly surprised. "Is everything all right?" I just wanted to thank your daughter," Harold said, his voice formal but sincere. "Her gesture yesterday was unexpected and deeply appreciated." Amelia appeared behind her mother, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Beckett," she exclaimed, stepping forward, "do you want to come in?" Harold hesitated, unaccustomed to such casual warmth, but Amelia's enthusiasm was infectious. "If it's not too much trouble," he said. Inside, the Johnson home was a stark contrast to Harold's mansion. It was small and cluttered, with mismatched furniture and faded wallpaper. But it felt alive. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, and a pile of laundry sat in the corner. Amelia's father, a tall man with tired eyes but a warm smile, stood from his chair to shake Harold's hand. "Welcome, Mr. Beckett," he said, his grip firm. "We've heard a lot about you." Harold spent the afternoon with the Johnsons, listening as they talked about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. It was an entirely new experience for him, being part of a conversation that wasn't about business or money. As the hours passed, he found himself relaxing, his usual reserve giving way to genuine curiosity and even laughter. When he left that evening, Amelia ran after him. "Are you coming back?" she asked. Her eyes hopeful. Harold smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "If you'll have me," he said. Over the weeks that followed, Harold became a regular visitor at the Johnson home. He brought small gifts for Amelia, books, art supplies, and once, a globe that lit up when you spun it. But it wasn't just Amelia who benefited from his visits. Harold found himself drawn into the life of the family as a whole, offering to pay for repairs to their home and even quietly settling a few of their debts. At first, Amelia's parents were hesitant to accept his help, but they quickly realized that Harold wasn't just trying to ease his own guilt or loneliness. He genuinely cared about them. For Harold, the Johnsons became a lifeline, a glimpse of the life he had never allowed himself to have. But not everyone viewed his newfound generosity kindly. Harold's distant relatives, who had long been waiting in the wings for their share of his fortune, began to take notice. One afternoon, as Harold walked through town, he was confronted by his nephew, Roger, a slick and ambitious man who had always resented Harold's success. "Uncle Harold," Roger said, his tone dripping with false concern. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time with that family on the other side of town. Is everything all right?" Harold's jaw tightened. "I don't see how that's any of your concern." Roger smirked. "Oh, it's just that people are talking. A man like you, throwing his money around, it's bound to attract the wrong kind of attention." Harold walked away without responding. But Roger's words stayed with him. He knew that his relationship with the Johnsons would raise eyebrows, especially among those who saw him only as a source of potential inheritance. But Harold didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something meaningful, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Amelia's birthday came a month later, and Harold insisted on throwing her a party at his mansion. It was a modest affair, just the Johnson family and a few of Amelia's friends, but to Amelia, it was the most magical day of her life. Harold had transformed his dining room into a fairy tale setting, complete with twinkling lights and a cake so large it needed 2 people to carry it. As they sang "Happy Birthday," Harold found himself overcome with emotion. For years, his house had been a monument to his wealth, a symbol of his success. But today, it was filled with laughter, music, and the kind of joy he had thought he would never experience again. After the party, Harold and Amelia sat together in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating their faces. "Thank you," Amelia said, leaning her head against his arm. "This was the best birthday ever." Harold placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "Thank you, Amelia. You've given me more than you'll ever know." From that night on, their bond only deepened. Harold began to see the world through Amelia's eyes, its beauty, its potential, and its endless capacity for kindness. He started to engage more with the community, funding projects that benefited the town and even mentoring young entrepreneurs. Amelia, in turn, grew more confident, inspired by Harold's belief in her. But beneath their happiness, a shadow loomed. Harold's health, long neglected, began to show signs of decline. He kept it from Amelia, not wanting to burden her, but he knew his time was running out. Quietly, he began making arrangements, ensuring that the Johnsons would be taken care of when he was gone. Harold found himself returning to the Johnsons' home more often than he expected. What began as occasional visits turned into weekly traditions, Sunday dinners, where the laughter of Amelia and her family filled the room. For a man who had spent decades alone, the chaos of their household was both overwhelming and invigorating. He began to look forward to these evenings, where he could share stories of his youth and listen to Amelia's boundless dreams of becoming a teacher. One Sunday, as they sat around the table, Amelia's father, Marcus, asked Harold about his work. "Real estate, right?" Marcus asked, his tone conversational but tinged with curiosity. "Must have been something to build all that from the ground up." Harold nodded, setting his fork down. "It was hard work, long hours, tough decisions. I sacrificed a lot to get where I am." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Worth it?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Harold didn't know how to respond. He thought of his empty house, the years spent chasing wealth while letting life pass him by. Before he could answer, Amelia chimed in. "Maybe it was worth it so you could meet us," she said, grinning at him. The room burst into laughter. But Harold felt a lump form in his throat. For all his success, it wasn't until now, sitting in this cramped dining room surrounded by people who cared about him, that he felt truly wealthy. But not everyone welcomed Harold's newfound connection to the Johnsons. One afternoon, as Harold was leaving their home, he noticed a group of neighbors whispering and glancing his way. He heard snippets of their conversation. "Why's a man like him spending time here? You think he's trying to take advantage of them?" The insinuations stung, but Harold brushed them off. He had spent his life ignoring gossip and wasn't about to let it affect him now. Yet, the comments soon grew louder, spreading throughout the small town. Some accused him of meddling in the Johnsons' lives for selfish reasons, while others speculated he was trying to ease his conscience by playing benefactor. The Johnsons, too, faced their share of judgment. At the factory, Marcus overheard co-workers joking that he'd struck gold by befriending the richest man in town. Amelia's mother, Diane, was questioned by neighbors who hinted that Harold's interest in their family was suspicious. "It's not like that," Diane insisted one evening after a particularly heated conversation with a neighbor. "He's just lonely." And Amelia, she brought out something in him. "Something good." Marcus nodded but looked troubled. "People don't see it that way. They see an old man with money and a family that doesn't have much. They think we're using him." That evening, Diane sat Harold down. "You've been so kind to us, Mr. Beckett," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But I think it's best if you visit less often. People are starting to talk." Harold's heart sank. "Diane, I don't care what people say. Your family has given me something I can't find anywhere else." Diane smiled gently. "We know that, but this is a small town. And small towns don't let people forget." Amelia overheard the conversation and burst into the room. "No," she exclaimed, tears welling in her eyes. "He's not leaving us. He's part of our family now." Diane tried to comfort her, but Amelia turned to Harold, her voice trembling. "Don't let them push you away. Please." Harold knelt to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere, Amelia," he said softly, "not unless you want me to." Despite the gossip, Harold continued to spend time with the Johnsons, albeit more discreetly. He invited them to his mansion for dinners, where they could laugh and share stories without judgmental eyes watching them. Over time, the family grew more comfortable in his grand home, and Harold began to see it in a new light, not as a monument to his wealth, but as a place that could finally be filled with life. One evening, as they gathered in Harold's garden, Amelia asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Mr. Beckett, are you happy?" Harold hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "I think I'm learning how to be," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought happiness came from success, from achieving things, but now I see it's about who you share your life with." Amelia beamed at him, her youthful optimism a stark contrast to the years of loneliness Harold had endured. "Then you're on the right track," she said. The bond between Harold and Amelia deepened as the months went on. He began attending her school events, cheering her on at her spelling bee and watching proudly as she won first place. He helped her with her homework, teaching her lessons not just in math and history but in resilience and determination. One day, while they were walking through town, Harold stopped at the edge of the park. He had funded its renovation months earlier, but he hadn't yet seen the finished project. Now, as he stood beside Amelia, he watched children laugh and play on the new swings and slides. "This is because of you," Amelia said, her voice full of admiration. "No," Harold replied, his gaze fixed on the children. "It's because of us." As joyful as those months were, Harold couldn't ignore the signs of his failing health. His doctor had warned him years ago about the consequences of his relentless work schedule and lack of self-care. But Harold had dismissed the warnings. Now, his body was reminding him of all he had neglected. At first, he kept it to himself. He didn't want to burden the Johnsons, especially not Amelia, who looked up to him with such hope and admiration. But Diane noticed the changes, the way he winced when he stood, the weight he seemed to lose overnight. "You're not well, are you?" she asked one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Harold sighed, his shoulders sagging. "No, Diane, I'm not." "Have you told Amelia?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Not yet. She's just a child. She doesn't need to worry about me." But Diane disagreed. "She loves you, Harold. She deserves to know." Later that week, Harold sat Amelia down in his study. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I'm not as strong as I used to be. My body, it's slowing down." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. But she didn't look away. "Does that mean you're going to leave us?" Harold reached for her hand, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. "Not yet. And when I do, I want you to remember something. You've given me more joy than I thought I'd ever find. You've shown me what it means to be part of a family. That's something I'll carry with me, no matter what." Harold found himself drawn into the rhythm of the Johnson family's life in ways he had never expected. Each interaction with them seemed to peel back another layer of the walls he had built around himself. For years, he had avoided intimacy and connection, convincing himself that wealth was the only companionship he needed. Now, every moment spent with Amelia and her family made him question the life he had chosen. One evening, as Harold walked into their small but cozy home, he noticed Amelia helping her mother in the kitchen. They were kneading dough for bread, their hands dusted with flour, giggling at an inside joke. It was a simple, domestic scene, but it struck Harold deeply. In his vast mansion, he had a state-of-the-art kitchen that rarely saw use. Watching the Johnsons cook together, he realized it wasn't the kitchen that mattered, it was the people in it. "Mr. Beckett," Amelia called, breaking his thoughts. "We're making bread. Want to help?" Harold hesitated. "I'm not much of a cook." "That's okay," Amelia said with a grin. "You just have to get your hands dirty." Under their guidance, Harold rolled up his sleeves and joined in. His attempts were clumsy, his dough stuck to the counter, and his flour clouds earned him playful groans, but by the end of the night, the house smelled of freshly baked bread, and Harold had laughed more than he had in years. As they sat down to eat, Marcus raised a glass of iced tea. "To new traditions," he said, his gaze warm as it met Harold's. "To family," Harold added softly, surprising himself. But as Harold grew closer to the Johnsons, the cracks in his carefully constructed world began to show. His newfound happiness had not gone unnoticed by the town, or by those who had long viewed him as a distant benefactor whose fortune might one day trickle down to them. One afternoon, Harold was confronted by Roger again, his nephew who had become increasingly emboldened by rumors about Harold's relationship with the Johnsons. "You're embarrassing yourself, Uncle," Roger sneered, fawning over some poor family like a lost puppy. "What's next? Giving away your estate?" Harold's jaw tightened, but he refused to engage. "It's none of your concern, Roger." But Roger wasn't deterred. "Oh, it's my concern. You're throwing away everything you've built, for what? A couple of people who'll take what they can and leave when you're gone." The accusation stung, not because Harold believed it, but because it echoed his own deepest fears. For all the joy Amelia and her family brought him, he couldn't completely shake the doubt that their kindness might fade when the reality of his failing health and advancing age set in. Could they truly care for him? Or was he just a temporary distraction? The confrontation left Harold unsettled. And that evening, as he sat in his study, the shadows of his past loomed large. He thought of his parents, who had worked tirelessly but never achieved the success he had. He thought of Evelyn, the love he had lost to ambition. And he thought of Amelia, who had shown him a kind of love that asked for nothing in return the next day. Harold decided to confide in Diane. Sitting at the Johnsons' kitchen table, he spoke candidly about his fears. "I've spent my life building something I thought would last forever," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But now, I'm starting to wonder if it was all a mistake. What if people only see me as a means to an end?" Diane listened quietly, her expression calm but thoughtful. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Mr. Beckett, people will always have opinions. Some will judge you no matter what you do. But those of us who really know you, we see the man you are. Not the money, not the mansion, just you." Her words were a balm to Harold's weary soul. And for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that the love he had found with the Johnsons might truly be real despite the challenges. Harold remained determined to support the Johnsons in any way he could. One evening, as Marcus shared his concerns about losing hours at the factory due to cutbacks, Harold quietly began making arrangements. The next week, Marcus received a promotion, a role that would provide not only more stability but also a chance to spend more time with his family. When Marcus found out Harold was behind it, he confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Harold smiled. Because I know how proud you are. And because you deserve it. The gesture deepened the bond between them. But it also reinforced Harold's realization that love wasn't about grand displays of wealth. It was about lifting others up in ways that truly mattered as much as Harold tried to ignore his health. It became harder to hide the signs. One day, while playing chess with Amelia, he suddenly felt lightheaded and had to excuse himself. Diane noticed his pallor and insisted he see a doctor. The diagnosis wasn't good, his heart was failing. And without immediate intervention, his time would be limited. Harold chose not to tell Amelia, fearing it would break her heart. But Diane wasn't willing to let him face it alone. She's stronger than you think, Diane said, and she deserves the truth. That evening, Harold sat with Amelia under the stars in his garden. There's something I need to tell you, he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. I'm not as healthy as I used to be. Amelia's face fell, her eyes brimming with tears. Are you going to leave us? Not yet, Harold said, pulling her into a gentle hug. And even when I do, I'll always be with you. In everything you do, every dream you chase. You've changed my life. Amelia, you've given me a reason to believe in something greater than myself. The bond between Harold and Amelia grew even stronger in the weeks that followed. They spent hours talking about life, love, and the future. Harold began mentoring Amelia, encouraging her to think about the world beyond their small town. One evening, as they walked through the park Harold had renovated, he handed her a small notebook. This is for your dreams, he said. Write them down, every single one, and don't stop until you've made them all come true. Amelia hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his coat. I promise. The day began like any other. The sun filtered through the curtains of Harold's study, casting a golden glow on the room filled with books, antique furniture, and small mementos from his life. But there was an unusual stillness in the air. The housekeeper, Mrs. Langley, knocked on his door as she did every morning to bring his tea. But there was no response. She hesitated, a sense of unease creeping over her. Pushing the door open, she found Harold sitting in his chair by the window, his favorite place to watch the world go by. His hands rested on a notebook, the one he had given Amelia, now filled with her dreams written in her neat, looping handwriting. His face was peaceful, as though he had simply fallen asleep. But the stillness told her otherwise. The news spread quickly through the town. Harold Beckett, the reclusive millionaire turned beloved figure, had passed away quietly in his home. The Johnson family was among the first to hear. When the police arrived at their door later that day, Marcus opened it to find two officers standing solemnly. Mr. Johnson, one of them began, we're sorry to inform you that Mr. Beckett has passed away. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Amelia, who had been sitting on the floor with her schoolbooks, froze, her face going pale. No, she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. It can't be true. The officers explained that Harold had died peacefully in his sleep and that his lawyer would be contacting them soon regarding his will. Amelia ran to her room, clutching the notebook Harold had given her. Flipping through the pages, she wept, each word a reminder of the dreams they had shared. A week later, the Johnson family was invited to the reading of Harold's will at the grand estate he had once called home. The house, which had always seemed intimidating, now felt like a mausoleum, its grandeur a stark reminder of the man who had lived there alone for so many years. Harold's lawyer, a composed man named Mr. Graham, greeted them warmly and ushered them into the library. The room was filled with others, Harold's distant relatives, townspeople, and employees, all curious about the contents of the will. Roger, Harold's nephew, sat smugly near the front, clearly expecting a significant share of the fortune. Mr. Graham began reading the document, his voice steady and clear. Harold had left generous donations to the local hospital, the school, and the town's community center. But it was the final section that silenced the room. To Amelia Johnson, Mr. Graham read, his voice softening, the girl who taught me to dream again. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, assets, and funds. My only request is that she use it to create a life full of purpose and joy, and to share the kindness she so freely gave me. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Roger shot to his feet, his face red with anger. This is absurd, he shouted. She's just a child. He barely knew her. Mr. Graham calmly raised a hand. The will is legally binding. Mr. Beckett made his intentions clear. Emilia sat frozen in her chair, her small frame dwarfed by the opulence around her. "He left it all. To me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Diane placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, her own eyes brimming with tears. "He loved you, Emilia. You were his family." In the days that followed, Emilia struggled to come to terms with Harold's death and the enormous responsibility he had left her. The town was abuzz with gossip, some people praising Harold's decision, while others questioned why he had left his fortune to a child. Emilia heard the whispers at school, saw the judgmental looks when she walked through town, and felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her. "I don't know what to do," she confided to her parents one evening. "I don't know how to make him proud." Marcus knelt in front of her, his strong hands resting on her shoulders. "You don't have to do it all at once, sweetheart. Harold didn't leave this to you because he wanted you to carry a burden. He left it because he believed in you. Take it one step at a time." Encouraged by her family's support, Emilia began thinking about how she could honor Harold's legacy. She spent hours in his study, poring over his books and journals, learning about the projects he had been passionate about. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. Emilia decided to establish the Beckett Johnson Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to improving the lives of the people in their town. With her parents' help and guidance from Mr. Graham, she began allocating funds to causes that Harold had cared about: education, community development, and support for struggling families. The first project was close to her heart, transforming Harold's mansion into a community center. The grand halls and opulent rooms were repurposed into spaces for learning, art, and recreation. The library became a study space for students, the ballroom a venue for town events, and the garden a peaceful retreat for anyone seeking solace. Emilia also funded scholarships for local students, ensuring that others would have the opportunity to pursue their dreams. She started small, but the impact was immediate. Families who had once struggled to make ends meet found hope in the resources provided by the foundation. Through it all, Emilia kept Harold's memory alive. She spoke at town meetings, sharing stories of the man who had changed her life. "Harold taught me that kindness can transform the world," she said at one gathering, "and I want to spend my life passing that kindness on." Years passed, and Emilia grew into a confident and compassionate young woman. The foundation flourished under her leadership, and the town thrived in ways no one had imagined. But she never forgot the man who had made it all possible. Every year on Harold's birthday, Emilia visited his grave, bringing a small, lopsided cake just like the one she had given him all those years ago. She would sit by the headstone, talking to him as though he were still there. "Your dream lives on, Harold," she said one year, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And so does ours." One day, while organizing Harold's belongings in the study, Emilia found a sealed envelope addressed to her. Inside was a letter in his neat, deliberate handwriting. "Dear Emilia, if you're reading this, I'm no longer with you. But I want you to know that you gave me the greatest gift of all: love and purpose. You showed me that it's never too late to change, never too late to open your heart. You are my family, and I am so proud of you. Live boldly, dream endlessly, and never forget the light you brought into my life. With all my love, Harold." Tears streamed down Emilia's face as she held the letter close to her heart. She knew then that Harold's legacy wasn't just in the mansion or the foundation, it was in the lives he had touched, the lessons he had taught, and the love he had shared. Emilia's story became one of hope, resilience, and the power of connection. Through her work, Harold's name became a symbol of kindness and transformation, a reminder that even the loneliest among us can find redemption in love. And as Emilia stood at the mansion's grand entrance years later, watching children play in the garden and families gather in the halls, she knew Harold would be proud. His dream had become hers, and together, they had built a legacy that would last forever. The shock of Harold's passing reverberated through the town. But for Emilia, it was deeply personal. After the reading of the will, she couldn't shake the image of Harold sitting alone in his grand house. A man who had seemed invincible yet was so vulnerable in his final moments. She returned to his mansion, now hers, to reflect on the magnitude of what he had left behind. Walking through the quiet halls, Emilia felt an almost tangible presence of Harold's spirit. The study was as he had left it, his notebooks filled with plans and musings. On his desk, She found a hidden drawer that contained a series of letters Harold had written but never sent. They were addressed to people from his past, old friends, his estranged nephew Roger, and even Evelyn, the woman he had loved and lost. One letter caught her attention, addressed simply to the town. Inside, Harold had written a heartfelt apology for his years of detachment. He expressed regret for not using his wealth sooner to build relationships and contribute to the community. "I thought my worth was measured by what I could achieve," he wrote, "but I see now that it is measured by who I can lift up." Amelia decided the town needed to see this. It became the centerpiece of a memorial she organized in Harold's honor. The letter was read aloud at the event, bringing many to tears. Even those who had criticized Harold began to see him in a new light, as a man who had transformed in his final years. Not everyone was moved by Harold's story. Roger, his nephew, was furious over being left out of the will. He began spreading rumors, claiming that Amelia and her family had manipulated Harold in his final years. At first, the Johnsons ignored him, but as the gossip spread, Amelia found herself under scrutiny. One evening, Roger appeared at the mansion uninvited. "You think you deserve all this?" he sneered, gesturing at the opulent surroundings. "You're just a kid. What do you know about running an estate?" Amelia stood her ground, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Harold trusted me. He believed I could make a difference." Roger laughed bitterly. "You're playing with fire, little girl. This world isn't kind to people like you." His words stung, but Amelia refused to let them deter her. She knew Harold's faith in her was not misplaced, and she was determined to prove it. She decided to meet with Mr. Graham, Harold's lawyer, to ensure that every aspect of the will was airtight. As she navigated the complexities of managing Harold's estate and fending off Roger's challenges, Amelia found herself relying more on her family and the community. Marcus, her father, became her rock, offering advice and helping her make decisions. Diane, her mother, ensured Amelia stayed grounded, reminding her to take breaks and find moments of joy amidst the chaos. But it was Harold's lessons that resonated most. She remembered how he had always told her to dream boldly and act decisively. "Use your heart," he had said once, "but never forget your mind." Amelia began pouring her energy into the Beckett Johnson Foundation, ensuring it reflected Harold's values. She spearheaded a project to renovate the town's dilapidated school, turning it into a state-of-the-art facility with modern classrooms and a library named after Harold. She also launched a scholarship program for underprivileged students, giving them opportunities Harold never had growing up. The projects brought hope to the town, but they also attracted more scrutiny. Some residents questioned her ability to handle such a massive responsibility at her age, while others praised her vision. Through it all, Amelia remained steadfast, driven by the memory of Harold's unwavering belief in her. Roger, unwilling to let go of his resentment, filed a lawsuit to contest the will. He claimed Harold had been coerced in his final years and accused the Johnson family of exploiting his vulnerability. The case quickly became the talk of the town, with neighbors taking sides. The trial was grueling. Roger's lawyers presented witnesses who claimed Harold had seemed confused and isolated before his death. But Amelia's team countered with testimony from Harold's close associates, including Mr. Graham and the Johnsons, who spoke of his clarity and determination in rewriting his will. Amelia herself took the stand, her voice strong despite her nerves. She spoke about the bond she had shared with Harold, recounting the nights they spent talking about life and his regrets. "He wasn't manipulated," she said firmly. "He was loved, for the first time in his life. He felt part of something bigger than himself." The courtroom was silent as Amelia finished her testimony. Even Roger seemed momentarily struck by the sincerity in her words. In the end, the judge ruled in Amelia's favor, upholding Harold's will. The relief was overwhelming, but the experience left a mark on Amelia. She realized how fragile trust could be and how easily kindness could be misunderstood. But she also learned the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. With the lawsuit behind her, Amelia threw herself back into her work. She expanded the foundation's reach, partnering with nearby towns to fund community projects. The mansion became a hub of activity, hosting workshops, cultural events, and educational programs. One of her proudest moments came when the foundation launched its first international initiative, a school in a remote village where children had no access to education. Standing at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Amelia felt Harold's presence beside her, as if he were smiling down at the legacy they had built together. Back in her hometown, the perception of Harold continued to evolve. People who had once seen him as a distant, cold figure now remembered him as a man who had found redemption through love and generosity. His name became synonymous with transformation, and his story inspired others to look beyond their own walls and reach out to those in need on what would have been Harold's 75th birthday. Amelia organized a special event at the community center. It was a celebration of his life, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched directly or indirectly. The night was filled with music, laughter, and heartfelt speeches. Amelia stood before the crowd, holding the notebook Harold had left her. "This was Harold's greatest gift to me," she said, her voice steady. "Not the mansion, not the money, but the courage to dream. He showed me that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life. And that's what I want to continue, spreading his kindness, his vision, to as many people as I can." As the night drew to a close, Amelia stepped outside to the garden Harold had loved so much. She lit a single candle and placed it near his favorite bench, where he used to sit and watch the stars. Looking up at the sky, she whispered, "Thank you, Harold, for everything." Years later, Amelia, now a grown woman, stood at the entrance of the Beckett Johnson Foundation headquarters, which had grown into a global organization. A new plaque had just been installed, bearing Harold's favorite quote, "Our worth is measured not by what we achieve, but by who we lift up." As she walked through the bustling halls, filled with people working to improve lives around the world, Amelia felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Harold's dream had become her own, and together, they had created something timeless, a legacy built not on wealth, but on love, compassion, and hope. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed overwhelming, Amelia would still visit his grave with a small, imperfect birthday cake, because no matter how much time passed, Harold Beckett's greatest gift would always live on in her heart. As Amelia settled into managing Harold's estate and the foundation, she began to uncover pieces of his life that he had never spoken about. While organizing his personal papers, she discovered an old leather-bound journal hidden in the back of a drawer. Its pages were filled with Harold's thoughts, sketches, and records of his journey from poverty to wealth. Among the entries, one particular note stood out. "I built this empire with my own 2 hands, but the cost was more than I could afford. My fortune was born from sleepless nights and broken relationships. If I could start over, I'd choose love over ambition. But perhaps it's not too late to leave something meaningful behind." The journal also contained fragments of letters addressed to a woman named Evelyn. Amelia had heard Harold mention her once, in passing, as someone he had loved deeply but lost to his ambition. Intrigued, Amelia decided to track down Evelyn, believing that reconnecting with this part of Harold's past could bring closure to his story. After weeks of searching, she found Evelyn living in a nearby city. Now an elderly woman, Evelyn was initially hesitant to talk about Harold, but when Amelia showed her the journal and recounted the bond she had shared with him, Evelyn's demeanor softened. "He was a complicated man," Evelyn said, her voice tinged with both fondness and sadness. "But he had a heart that wanted to do good, even if he didn't always know how. I'm glad he found you." Evelyn shared stories about Harold that Amelia had never heard: his kindness in helping her family during tough times, his stubbornness, and the vulnerability he rarely showed. Evelyn even gave Amelia a photograph of Harold as a young man, standing beside her with a shy smile. "Keep this," she said. "It belongs with you now." Roger, though defeated in court, wasn't ready to give up entirely. He began spreading false stories in the press, accusing the foundation of mismanaging Harold's wealth and suggesting Amelia was too young and inexperienced to handle the responsibilities she had inherited. Amelia found herself under constant scrutiny, but help came from an unexpected source. One day, a former business partner of Harold's, an elderly man named Mr. Whitmore, arrived at the foundation's office. He was a towering figure, with a booming voice and an air of authority. But his eyes softened when he spoke of Harold. "Harold and I didn't always see eye to eye," Mr. Whitmore admitted, "but he was a man of his word. When I heard what his nephew has been saying, I couldn't sit idly by." With Mr. Whitmore's guidance, Amelia navigated the complexities of the business world with newfound confidence. He taught her how to defend herself against Roger's accusations, how to handle media scrutiny, and how to channel her frustration into determination. "I'm not just doing this for Harold," Mr. Whitmore said one day. "I'm doing it because you remind me of him, fierce, determined, and unwilling to give up." Despite Roger's efforts, the community began to rally around Amelia. The projects funded by the foundation were transforming the town, and people saw the tangible impact of her work. The school renovations had created opportunities for students to excel, and the community center at Harold's mansion had become a safe haven for families in need. One evening, as Amelia was returning home, she found a group of townspeople waiting for her outside the community center. They had organized a surprise celebration to show their gratitude. The event featured heartfelt speeches, music, and a slideshow of the foundation's achievements. Harold Beckett was a man who kept to himself for so long. One of the speakers said, "But in his final years, he showed us what it means to truly give back. And it's because of you, Amelia, that his dream has become a reality." Tears filled Amelia's eyes as she listened to their words. For the first time since Harold's passing, she felt the weight of her grief lift slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose determined to stop the foundation's success. Roger resorted to drastic measures. He began gathering evidence to claim that Harold had been coerced into rewriting his will. Hiring private investigators to dig into the Johnsons' past. He even tried to bribe former employees of Harold's estate to testify against Amelia. When Amelia discovered Roger's plans, she felt the weight of her responsibility press down harder than ever. But instead of succumbing to fear, she decided to confront him directly. She requested a meeting at the town's courthouse, with Mr. Graham and her parents by her side. "You've spent so much time trying to tear me down," Amelia said, her voice steady but firm. "But what have you built?" Harold believed in creating something meaningful, something lasting. "All you've done is try to destroy his legacy." Roger smirked, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything you thought was yours." Amelia stepped closer. "You're right, I don't. But Harold didn't leave you out of his will to punish you. He left it to someone who could carry out the work he wanted to do. This isn't about me or you, it's about him." The confrontation marked a turning point. Roger, realizing he was fighting a losing battle, withdrew his efforts, though he remained bitter. Amelia, on the other hand, felt stronger than ever, having faced her greatest adversary with integrity as the years passed. Amelia continued to expand the foundation's reach, but she always kept Harold's core values at heart. She created a scholarship program in his name, offering young people the chance to pursue their dreams. She also established a mentorship initiative, pairing successful professionals with aspiring entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. One of the most profound moments came when Amelia decided to write a book about Harold's life. Titled The Legacy of Kindness, it chronicled his journey from isolation to connection, his regrets, and his transformation through love and purpose. The book became a bestseller, with proceeds going directly to the foundation. In the final chapter, Amelia wrote, "Harold Beckett taught me that it's never too late to change. His story is proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward, creating a legacy that lasts far beyond our lifetimes." On the 10th anniversary of Harold's passing, Amelia stood in the mansion's garden, now a public park filled with flowers and laughter. Children played on swings, families picnicked on the grass, and the air was filled with music from a local band. Amelia walked to the bench where Harold had often sat, carrying a small, lopsided cake with a single candle. Lighting the candle, she whispered, "Happy birthday, Harold. I hope you're watching." As the candle flickered in the evening breeze, Amelia looked up at the stars. In her heart, she felt his presence, a quiet reassurance that she was on the right path. She had built something extraordinary from the love he had shown her, and she knew his spirit would always be a part of her.